questions, comments?
Peut-être une manière d'ouvrir sur autre chose, c'est peut-être pas vraiment une question, mais comment est-ce que cette question de will, kind et judgment en fait serait purement liée à la loi chrétienne en fait? Parce qu'à la fin, ou en quoi? Parce qu'à la fin de la pièce, c'est Portia qui fait tout un éloge de la grâce. Et la grâce qui, dans la tradition, en fait, n'appartient qu'à la chrétienté, c'est-à-dire même encore dans notre loi. Aujourd'hui, le pouvoir de gracier, c'est-à-dire notre loi telle qu'elle est faite, dépend de certains critères qui appartiennent au christianisme. Et comment ça se joue pour vous par rapport à... C'est très large, c'est juste de...
Si je comprends la question. So the question is, these three operations of law are features of Christian culture, Christian law. And I think that's right. I think that's quite right. And they can all be folded into the Christianity of the Christian bias of the text. Except that, since judgment in fact is, if you want, the supreme court in the world of the play, then it's not necessarily bound to kind or to will, and since it's oriented by its nature toward futurity, that is, it is open to post-Christian or non-Christian ways of thinking. If it were not, then the play would be stuck in the water of its own time. But that's really interesting. But the play, and this is true about literature generally, and it's one of the things that I want to argue. I mean, it's something it shares with the law, with the common law, and that is a kind of openness to the future. When one is writing a judgment within the common law, you always have to bear in mind that this judgment has to stand up to future tests. That it might not, it might well not stand up to future tests. It might be reversed down the line. So this seems to be a feature of literature, a very particular feature of literature, though it shares it with the common law, and that is inasmuch as the judgment in the play is supreme, and inasmuch as that is necessarily oriented toward futurity, it is not bound to the culture that produced the play. Shakespeare writes, therefore, he creates structures that can travel beyond his own lifetime. And that means that while the play, as someone like Barbara Lewalski has argued it very persuasively and in great detail, the play can be folded back into the culture that produced it. What I want to argue is that it need not be, and as a matter of fact, it has not remained within the culture that produced it. And of course what that means is that literary meaning is going to be diachronic, it's going to be historical through and through. Literary meaning doesn't mean Shakespeare's intention or the meaning of the play in its own time. It means, in fact, the meaning that the play has gathered, has accrued over time. All of that from its different instantiations over time is part of the meaning. Some of those are Christian and some are not. I mean, that's why it's so interesting, because the play was a favorite and has been. It might still be a favorite with anti-Semitic communities. One woman told me when she was growing up, she's a Jewish woman, she told me when she was growing up in Romania that at Easter they would have the running of the Jews. So it's a kind of performance of the Romanian version of The Merchant of Venice as a celebration of the rising of Christ and the triumph over the Jews. So there, the play is angrily and forcefully a feature of Christian culture, and not in a good way. So that's a very interesting question.
How does the portrayal of Shylock as the outsider relate to other portrayals of outsiders, foreigners, the Moor, or whomever, in other places, in Shakespeare's body of work, or in contemporary authors at the time, as a non-citizen, as someone different, as in all the features that makes him different from the Venetian in this play, but any other mainstream group in other plays within Shakespeare's or in the contemporary theater.
It is evidently a fascination of Shakespeare's, and it doesn't just belong to Shakespeare, it belongs to other playwrights of the period, who write about Black Africans, who write about Jews, who write about Persians, who write about, there's some Amerindians on the stage and so on, or characters, Amerindian characters. And there are various ways of approaching this, I think. One of them, and this is an approach that's been fairly popular in the critical literature recently, is to think about the English coming to an understanding of their own identity as a people. And this goes in two directions. One, they will put on stage aliens in order to give themselves a sense of their own ethical and racial coherence.
Or superiority.
And superiority will go along with that, absolutely. Absolutely. And the other is that they will put on stage ethnic, racial others in order to suggest the hybridity of the English people and the English nation. And both of those things go on in Shakespeare. And sometimes it's difficult to prize them apart. So that's one approach, is thinking in terms of national community. England beginning to understand itself. After all, Shakespeare was as I said, Shakespeare was a foreigner in London. One of the reasons that one particularly interesting book has argued that Shakespeare went after the rank of gentleman, because he reapplied to the College of Heralds for the rank of gentleman. His father had put in the original application, and Shakespeare renewed it when he began to make some money. By the way, the College of Heralds is an excellent example of a law of kind, because the college doesn't actually change your designation. What it does is it goes back into the records, it goes into the archives, and they find out that in fact you always were a gentleman, you always were a gentleman, and it just got lost sight of. So, because they can't change kind. This is very deeply embedded in the culture. And so that's one approach to this question about the alien. The other one is something that I'm more interested in. I think it's perhaps more interesting to the work that you're doing. And that is that someone like Shakespeare himself is an alien. He's an alien in London, but he's also an alien to the high culture, to the public culture of his own time. He, after all, is a commoner. And even after he gets his gentlemanly status, and he gets a coat of arms, and he gets a motto, non sans droit. They make jokes about him, like Ben Jonson has a character whose motto is not without mustard, which is apparently a joke on Shakespeare's expense, because...
non sans droit.
Non sans droit. And,
sans S-A-N-S.
Yeah, or Z.
Or Z, yeah.
Or Z. And Shakespeare came from yeoman stock, good country yeoman stock. Their favorite food was roast beef. Their favorite thing to put on their roast beef was mustard. And roast beef without mustard was just not a dish for a good yeoman. So Jonson has this character whose motto is not without mustard. So Shakespeare was, treated as a bit of a figure of fun because of his social ambition. But this book by John Archer argues that he went after this improvement in his rank because he didn't have a legitimate identity as a citizen of London. And I think there's something to this. Not only that, but as somebody who was a player and a playwright, he didn't have any legitimate place in the elite culture of early modern England. And this is part of a much larger argument and a much larger project that I've been working on for some years. His work didn't have a legitimate publicness. Its publicity was, as it is described in Sonnet 111, public means that public matters breeds a kind of degraded, commercial, working man being out in the street kind of publicity, rather than the publicity that belonged to the social elite or to the queen. So this is a society in which many people, besides Shylock, are deemed to be less than fully human. They're not gentlemen, they're commoners. They're subject actually to different sets of laws. They're not allowed to wear certain kinds of cloth, they're not allowed to carry arms. And their punishments for crimes are different from the punishments that apply to gentlemen and noblemen. So one of the reasons that there's such a interest in the alien on Shakespeare's stage, not just by Shakespeare, is because his audience, which is very large and mixed, contains many people who are wondering about their own status as human beings, their own status as members of the polity, with the rights of citizens in the general sense of the word. And so there's a real thinking about, and this is very germane to your topic, there's a real thinking about going on, there's a real thinking going on in the drama about what it means to be a public person. And I take it that's a constant feature of Shakespeare's writing. And so he constantly has these characters who, like Shylock, like Othello, like Catherine in The Taming of the Shrew, like any number of these characters, like Aaron in Titus Andronicus, who are evidently alien and less than fully human, who make a claim, nevertheless, on the rights of a human being, as Shylock does in court. What Shylock's predecessor does, Shylock's immediate predecessor in the drama is the character Barabbas in Marlowe's play Jew of Malta. He never tries to take anyone to court, he would just poison his enemy. He takes great pleasure in it. And what Shakespeare's doing is rethinking Marlowe's theater of violence in terms of the theater of law, if you want. Theater of theatrical law, where judgment belongs to the audience. And one of the very interesting features of Shakespeare's drama is the real emphasis on how bad law is. I don't think there are any successful court cases in Shakespeare. I may be wrong about this. I don't think there are any. They're always kind of exhibitions of injustice. And what Shakespeare is suggesting through this is that if you want justice, you better go to the theater. It's the theater itself that can provide justice and not the courts. Yeah. Sure.
My question is focused on the idea of age. Specifically, in Shakespeare, we see that many times questions of justice are illuminated by people who do not fully belong to adulthood, who are sort of like an in-between stage. And we know that marriage was a rite of passage into adulthood until, well, just recently. So why do you think that these characters sort of crystallize ideas of law and justice that an adult would not be able to bring into light? Like how do they question renewing justice, ideas of justice, specifically in the merchant defendant?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's a really interesting question. It just opens up another kind of area that I
because we have to
paying
think
attention
about
to.
age. I mean, not age and gender, but specifically age. They're minors, are they not? For me.
Yes. I guess the first character that my thoughts are drawn to is Rosalind.
I was thinking about Hamlet, but yes.
Is Rosalind in As You Like It, who's a kind of happier alien, a happier version of the alien. She, in fact, has been made an alien by the usurpation of her father, and has become a stranger in her own kingdom, her own dukedom. But she's also, I believe, a minor, and in any case requires the permission of her father to marry the man of her choice. And the whole play, the whole thing, is about her willfulness and her ability to innovate, using the means of theater to get her will, to have her will. So all of that is pertinent to what you're talking about. I'd also say that, and I'm just kind of putting pieces together randomly now, she would also be, you'd also have to think about her story in terms of this, in terms of the law of kind, because gender, we didn't talk about gender, but gender is really important in the play, and there's a tremendously conservative dimension, because the play puts in question differences of gender and then powerfully reasserts them at the level of the body through Rosalind's corporeal responses. Her desire, her nausea, her inability to deal with violence, her inability to deal with the sight of blood. So again, like Merchant of Venice, it's the same kind of will, kind, okay audience, it's up to you to judge. It's a happier, easier judgment to make, but it's still left to us. And so I would still try to think about that in this kind of tripartite model. Tell me about Hamlet.
Well, Hamlet for me is sort of it reminds me of ancient forms of justice, justice of mourning and justice of blood, generational blood, specifically those of Antigone and Electra and Orestes in another perspective. So Hamlet for me is sort of the figure of the adolescent justice maker who has to absolutely find a way to respect the name of his father, and that's his claim. His claim is that the law of blood is superior to the law of state, or the law of the statesman, or the law of the king, or the law of that which is written. So I think that for me it's always sort of not necessarily tripart, but yeah.
Okay, can I add this to what you just said about Hamlet?
Yeah.
He could go. His father's ghost says, "This is what you did. Yeah. This is what you got to do. You got to kill Claudius. You could go and kill Claudius." Instead, he does a whole bunch of other things.
Exactly.
Why does he do all these things? And I would suggest that the reason he's doing that is because he wants his act to be justified. He seeks judgment. And he cannot get judgment if he just goes ahead and kills Claudius, because they'll just say, that's what you expect. We expected he would come back and kill the king so he could be king.
But also, what he wants when he dies, that he tells his friend, he wants futurity also. Absolutely. He wants people to acknowledge his gesture beyond his own life. Absolutely. So there is the idea of judgment also. Absolutely. Because there's the renewal in the future.
And he knows that it has to be projected into the future.
Exactly.
And so it's like what Antonio says to Bassanio. He says, tell your wife this story and let her judge it. That's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things about one of the interesting differences between Hamlet and Merchant is that Horatio we actually see Horatio having a chance to begin to tell Hamlet's story. Yeah. And he just makes a complete botch of it. Right? And I realized something, is that when he's telling Fortinbras about the sort of giving him the executive summary of events leading up to this pile of bodies, he doesn't mention the ghost.
Yeah.
And it's the ghost that justifies Hamlet.
Yes.
But he can't mention the ghost. Because Fortinbras is going to say, excuse me, a ghost told him that his father was murdered by his uncle.
Well, the whole point is that the whole play sort of brings into question the idea of sanity.
Yes.
What is justice of the blood, which is insane and feminine, which is foolish. Well, they call Hamlet. Hamlet is always being described as being foolish and female. So we can't really go back on the idea of the ghost or because it's folly. It's complete folly, and it does not belong in the register of the law. The law is not, ghost.
That's right. It's not covered.
Yeah.
Can you bring? That's why he wants corroboration.
Yes.
And can you bring this idea about migration and the idea of the alien other into your thinking about Hamlet?
Well, I'm no specialist at all, far from that. But doesn't Hamlet leave? Doesn't he leaves and he writes a letter when he's away, and I don't know. It's too rudimentary. The question, for me lies in a. But I'm sure the adolescent itself is a way to question what is inside and outside of a society, what belongs and what does not belong, and how through the contract of marriage, especially with Hamlet, how it legitimizes his actual place. Like he has to get married to become a man, and I think that I don't know.
Okay.
It doesn't
No, but I don't
know. I don't know.
I think you're right to talk about the young. It makes me wonder. Are there old people in Shakespeare? There's not many there, but are there old people who?
Most of them are young. There are fathers, mothers, and young people.
Okay.
Sisters.
On another subject. When you read the passage number 6, Portia, you mentioned the importance of common law and the rule of equity very rapidly. And
let's go back to that.
Yes, the importance of precedence, etc. Well, the rule of equity, it seems to me that it requires the people in the city, Venice or London, and the ruling class of these cities, to be more careful about the rights of others, including the others, Jews and foreigners. Isn't there a contradiction between how we treat these people and that the common law is based on the rule of equity, etc.? Isn't it contradictory?
Let me think my way into the question. Where's the contradiction?
Well, the common law is based on the precedent, and you mentioned very briefly, and you said that you will not develop this question, the rule of equity. So basically, this rule of equity requires the governors and people as well, citizens, not to exclude the others because they are others, Jews or foreigners. So isn't there a contradiction between what's happening in the whole play of Merchant of Venice and this rule of the requirement of this rule of equity?
The common law courts could accommodate the cases of foreigners in London. So it seems to me that foreigners could get good treatment or bad treatment whether they went to a common law court or the court of equity. So thinking into the question, equity holds out the possibility. That is to say, we're not bound by the law, what the law has done in the past. We can look at this situation on its own terms. That on the face of that, it makes sense to say that that's the kind of law that is going to be more flexible. That this was an argument that was made in favor of equity. To be more flexible, faster on its feet, lighter on its feet, able to move with the times more easily, able to provide justice to people who would not find justice before the common law. So that wasn't a particular important part of the argument between the common lawyers and the Court of Equity, except that someone like Coke, who was the great kind of advocate of the common law, made it into a kind of argument for English nationhood. So it became associated with the ethnically English. And there was that kind of. Coke would sort of argue that this is the law we know. This is the law that grew up here. It's of this soil. It doesn't come from the continent. It doesn't come from antiquity. So in that way, the common law would be less likely to be a friend of the foreigner, of the alien, than the Court of Equity. That makes sense.
And equity was seen as of foreign origin?
No, but it wasn't. But the way Coke presented it wasn't a kind of native born. It wasn't native born, and it was associated with a top-down kind of law, whereas Coke made the case that this was a kind of bottom-up kind of law, and sort of nested within the legal soil of England. So in that way, yes, the case that's before this court has a bearing on this particular issue that was of some currency in London at the time. The broader question, which is the relationship between different forms of law and the situation, the capacity of a society to be welcoming to the alien, to be just to the alien. That's a big, broad question, and that seems to be a question that it would be one of the questions for the research group over the long term.
Mm-hmm.
It's quiet.
Yes.
Perhaps I
Go
can
for it.
ask a simple question. I was thinking a little bit about my own research because I've been working with social cosmologies, and when you stressed the dog man and the lack of status of the outsider, the non-Venetian terms of Shylock, I wonder if if the law at the time reflected the same lower status in the social cosmology or the spiritual cosmology. I know there's often an oversimplified way to teach Shakespeare because I was submitted to it by one of my professors, where we would look at the chain of being and then it would be applied in an overly simplistic way to the ideologies of the plays. But at the same time, I was wondering, in terms of context, when you talk about the play itself as a site of judgment, would the audiences have known about laws that specifically limited the will of the Jews based on these social cosmologies and spiritual cosmologies?
So, the question is, I guess, about cultural and ideological contexts in the late 16th century, especially having to do with the situation of the Jews.
And the law, yes.
That's a good question. There's a kind of idea that is circulating in Shakespeare's own time that there are no Jews in England. There are Jews in England, not a great many. I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't know at all if there are laws specifically for the differences between Jews and Christians, as there are or seem to be in the Venice of Shakespeare's imagination. So I don't know the answer to that question. And it's certainly one, you know, I've read a lot of work on this play and on the Jews in early modern Europe, and I can't think of laws that pertain to the Jews in England. So there are interesting laws, though not in England, but on the continent, that pertain to animals. There's wonderful work on the hanging of dogs. I don't know if you've, and this is pertinent to this play, which refers to the hanging of a wolf. There were cases in Europe in the period where dogs that had injured or killed people were brought before the court on criminal charges, found guilty, and were hanged. And in fact, the phrase in English, a hanged dog look, which I always thought meant just to have a long face, actually refers to what a dog looks like when it's hanged. Now,
I forgot to say thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I enjoyed your talk very much. It's very clear and thought-provoking. Thanks a lot.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for being here.
Metaphor.
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in knowing the kinds of things that you have been talking about just a little bit, and where you see the work going.
What elements of futurity here? Where we're going, I don't know about you, I certainly don't know where we're going. It's really an exploratory work, experimental work.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I have no idea because my grasp of literary theories and analysis is minimal.
Okay.
And so I have no idea what's going to come out of the study of the body of work that we're going to study. Reciprocally, probably lawyers in the room, not lawyers, but people in literature in the room have little knowledge of how we'll deal with the legal issues and other non-literary issues. I think the idea is really to explore. It comes from a common feeling, and that refers very nicely with your conclusion on theatrical judgment. I think the common assumption that we made when we were discussing literature on migration is that authors, playwrights, novelists seem to be a quarter century in advance of the rest of society in how they integrate multiculturalism, plurality, differences. They seem to be way, way ahead of anyone else in being able to grasp that, which is something which has been noted with artists in general. I mean, Guernica being the example always given of not pre-science, but a better understanding of what's to come. And that literature on migration, which started, and plurality, which started somewhat 20 years ago, as a mass movement within literature, has struck us as being prémonitoire somehow. And I think it comes from that common experience. There is something there that tells us about our society, of where our societies are going, that we don't find in newspapers and the media generally. We don't find it in the law. we don't find in legal reasoning. I mean, we're still stuck with very traditional views about foreigners and their rights and their et cetera, et cetera. So there is this vision of the future that authors and playwrights carry with them, and that we want to explore. And at the same time, for me, my direct concern is about the human rights of migrants.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's about respecting the human rights of the foreigner, of the person who's different. And we've done that with women, and we've done that with Aboriginals, and we've done that with minorities and detainees and gays and lesbians, and all those who were different from the initial group of white landowners, white and middle-aged landowners, which was the core group of democracy in the 19th century. So we've done that, but the foreigners is sort of the end of the road, because the foreigners is not part of the polity of the community. And the foreigner doesn't vote, and the foreigner doesn't complain, and the foreigner tries to move on. And so the foreigner cannot access the normal mechanisms for having her voice heard, like Aboriginals and minorities and women got their voice heard, and they screamed until they were heard and mobilized. Foreigners can't do that. So at present, it's only the law, it's only judges that really tell the government, you can't do that, because there's no mobilization.
Yes. Yeah.
So the way that in literature we see the description of this violence in general against foreigners, and the redemption that comes through knowing the foreigner, because the foreigner is always cast as a horde, as a group that's going to invade us and overcome our civilization. It's a portrayal. But as soon as you know the person, as soon as the person is made human, I mean what Hazlitt says, suddenly the person is not that foreign, actually. And that's what I think literature does to the foreigner, to the different, is making the person part of us by simply getting us to know the person. And how does that translate into law is my concern. But
il y a certainement aussi le souhait dans notre travail d'interroger les notions de récit et aussi la notion de sujet. Dans l'étude des textes littéraires, de manière à faire surgir dans le domaine du droit, mais aussi dans le domaine de l'étude des textes littéraires, de l'analyse de discours, des réflexions sur les modes de ce que l'on appellera en français, c'est un peu foucaldien, mais les modes de subjectivation qui interviennent dans des situations de grande précarité, qui sont celles des migrants des sans-droit. Et un autre aspect, je crois, qui est important dans notre projet commun, c'est aussi du fait que l'on travaille dans un contexte biculturel, bilingue, c'est d'avoir aussi dans notre séminaire des récits qui proviennent de deux grandes traditions culturelles, anglophones et francophones. C'est-à-dire que c'est pas la même chose que d'avoir Rougedi et d'avoir Patrick Chamoiseau, qui est un grand écrivain du domaine francophone, et on a différentes façons de se représenter à la fois l'étranger, différentes façons de se représenter ce qu'est la migration, selon qu'on provient d'un domaine qui est celui, je dirais, de la globalisation littéraire anglophone, mais aussi du domaine de la francophonie. Donc ça, c'est un aspect qui relève, je dirais, des représentations à la fois idéologiques, mais aussi, je dirais, des représentations sociales de la migration, en incluant aussi dans cette francophonie tout un domaine très très important depuis au moins une trentaine d'années qui a été défini comme écriture migrante, migrant writing, Il y a eu de très très nombreux auteurs au Québec, à Montréal notamment. On a eu Joël Desrosiers, il y a Dany Laferrière, il y a Yin Chen, francophone. Mais on a aussi Raouillage, qui est un auteur anglophone, mais on ne voit pas les choses comme ça. Ça ne nous intéresse pas, nous, de faire anglo-franco. Ils sont à Montréal. Bon, point. C'est ça qui nous intéresse. Bon, voilà. Mais c'est d'étudier, finalement, à partir d'un certain nombre d'auteurs. On aura Émile Olivier, on va avoir un roman policier écrit par un auteur que malheureusement, je n'ai pas en tête ce midi, un auteur africain. On va avoir un certain nombre de textes. C'est d'étudier donc cette diversité de représentation du sujet, du récit et du rapport au cadre juridique. Troisième aspect, je crois, qui concerne plus ceux qui sont dans le domaine littéraire, mais ce serait, je crois que c'est partagé par les collègues en droit, par François Crépeau et par tous ceux qui sont ici, c'est d'étudier aussi, de façon très concrète, comment ça marche. C'est-à-dire, quelle méthodologie utiliser en termes d'analyse de discours ou même de rhétorique. Évidemment, rhétorique ancienne, mais de Perelman à des auteurs plus récents. Comment envisager l'inscription topique, finalement, de la loi dans un registre qui est celui de la fiction. Donc ça, c'est un autre aspect, je crois, qui nous intéresse.
L'aspect récit, narrative, est assez important parce qu'il y a récit sur les migrants et récit des migrants. Et là, il y a une interface droit-littérature qui est importante. Tout le travail du demandeur d'asile est de créer un récit, son propre récit. Bob Barsky a écrit un livre, Constructing a Productive Other. C'est soi. Tout le rôle du récit du demandeur d'asile, c'est de créer une histoire qui soit crédible, ça c'est une des questions juridiques, la crédibilité, et de faire en sorte que cette histoire réponde aux critères du statut de réfugié et puisse être utilisée par le décideur. Donc, il y a la projet. Et ce récit correspond plus ou moins à l'histoire réelle que personne ne peut connaître, puisqu'il n'y a pas d'autres témoins. Donc tout le processus de découvrir une réalité, une vérité, passe au travers du récit, et l'importance du récit est une importance clé. Et les modes de narration sont différents en fonction des cultures, le rapport au temps, le rapport à l'espace, le rapport à la famille, tout ça est différent et tout ça doit être interprété, réinterprété, et le droit part d'une conception dans laquelle chaque mot n'est utilisé que dans un seul sens, alors qu'en littérature, tout le monde connaît la polysémie, mais en droit, il n'y a pas de polysémie, il ne peut pas y avoir de polysémie. Oui, il ne devrait pas y avoir de polysémie. Donc là, il y a tout un rapport au récit qui est très intéressant.
Yeah, I'd say when you told me about it, I was very drawn to the idea of migration.
Mm-hmm.
And the radicalism of focus on migration. There's the case in Ontario of the farm workers who were in that accident. They were in the back of a van, and most of them were killed. Those who survived, just a few who survived, got hospitalization after some public complaints from, my daughter is a disability lawyer in Ontario, and so she was on, that was her case. She's very interested in it, so she's a labor lawyer. But because they embarrassed the government paid for one member of their family to come and be at their bedside while they were recovering. Once they're recovered, they're immediately deported. And though they have been invited here as guest workers, they don't receive any workers' compensation. And the condition of being a migrant means that you do not have a stable status within a polity, within a legal system. You're moving all the time. And in this case, that means that they're simply deported back, and and they don't get the benefits to which they would otherwise be entitled. And when I started to think about that, now I haven't kind of worked it into my own understanding. I guess I have worked it into my own understanding of thinking about literature as migrant. That is to say, and Shakespeare is a very odd example of that because he seems to be an iconic figure, the most stable figure one could imagine. But I actually want to recapture something of the transiency, the migrancy, the constant mobility and changefulness of Shakespeare. People, you know, the theater was really a kind of new institution. Nobody knew quite what to do with it, what laws applied to it, what its status was in society. That was so much up in the air. So it was a kind of migrant form of cultural production. And to think about literature as something that is never finished. Because, you know, one of the things that I'm trying to say about this play is that, well, in its own time, it was probably, people said, good, good, I'm glad he's dead or whatever. I don't think that was necessarily what they thought, but that it was embedded within a Christian culture that had a high degree of anti-Semitism, in which a Jew could readily be identified as a villain. There are lots of reasons that Shakespeare provides them within the structure of the play to think differently, but to think of the play as something that is in constant motion, so that we can never say, if someone says, what is the meaning of The Merchant of Venice, or someone says to me, is The Merchant of Venice anti-Semitic? I say, well, that's a long story. In fact, that's precisely the point. It's the story of the play from its first performances to now, and it's not ended yet. And it won't end because this is a migrant form. So in some ways, literature connects with human migration because it's something that's always in movement. Now, of course, literature is constantly also being institutionalized. Shakespeare is a prime example of that. Bedded down within a foundation that gives it a particular stability, a particular meaning. You know, and this is one of the things that goes on in university classes and college classes all the time. This is what Shakespeare means. Right? And then also the teachers will say, this is what Shakespeare meant in his own time, as if to say, this is what it means. As if anybody could know what it was. So I love this idea of mobility, which is a positive way of talking about someone who is not allowed to stop moving, who is required to move. Migrant workers are, of course, a radical case of that, but recent migrants, before they have their permanent residency, are in a curious kind of legal limbo.
Sure. Asylum seekers are in a curious legal limbo.
Yes.
People who have been recognized refugee, but not given permanent residence, are in a legal limbo. Many people are, and irregular migrants are in a legal limbo. Because the narrative of the government is that they have no rights.
Yes.
When the law says they have the same rights as we do, except the right to enter and stay, and the right to vote and be elected. All other fundamental rights protected by the Charter are for anyone, including them. But that's not what the government wants to say about them. So you have these narratives going through society where people actually... I had one very famous, I can say it here, Jean-François Lépine was interviewing me for... And at one point I says, the Charter applies to regular migrants. And he says, how come they have rights? I thought they were illegal. And coming from someone who is at the top of his profession in journalism. And I told myself, well, if he doesn't get that, a lot more people won't get it. But that's problematic.
It's also because we tend to think of migrants as not having the protection of the law.
Sure.
And this is an ancient idea.
If they want the law, they can go back home.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. I mean, it connects with ancient.
Sure.
Foreigners very often in ancient times are slaves. People have been captured and brought, so they have no protection.
And in the Middle Ages, when you had these people touring, going from city to city to work, for example, when they were stone carvers, they would not have any protection outside their country, whatever that meant of origin, But they would have other protections. They would be protected by their corporation. They would, you know, the French Parisian stone carver would go to Mannheim and would you know, work with stone carvers from Mannheim, and would be protected by that corporation, but would not be protected by the state. And if the person was killed in the street, there might not even be a trial, because he was a foreigner.
When Shakespeare's company left London, they were migrant workers, and they carried with them a letter from one of their patrons. So it would be a high-ranking nobleman in the country saying, please, give these people, accommodation and so on, and don't beat them. But they weren't their hosts weren't bound by that. That was just asking a favor. They had no legal rights, and they had few legal rights except property rights in London itself.
That's how the institution of consuls were created, in order to protect merchants, precisely. Merchants were traveling from fair to fair, from city to city, and then consuls were established in the, I think, end of 14th, beginning of 15th century, started to be established when the fair, the network of cities having different kind of fairs was re-established after the crumbling of the Middle Ages. Big countries, or powerful countries, started to have consuls in these cities to make sure that there would be an interlocutor if these people had a brush with the law for whatever reason. And there would be someone to defend them. So that was the first creation of sort of a first lex mercatoria that would extend beyond borders, but it was also a means of protection, etc. But that did not extend to the mere tourists.
It's really, I mean, you're opening up, first of all, to think about Shakespeare's company as a self-itinerant, it's self-migrant. It's exactly what they are. They have exactly that same relationship with the law that modern migrants have. But then I'm thinking about More's Utopia, which produces a kind of internal illegality, because if you leave your home province, and there's something like that going on in Shakespeare's England as well, you become an internal illegal immigrant and subject to severe penalties because of that. So that migrancy is not just a matter of crossing a national border, it can be within a particular nation in the period.
You have that in Russia and in China now.
And in Cuba also has laws of that.
But in Russia you have to have the propiska to go from one province to another. And in China, if you're not in your province of origin, you don't have access to schools, healthcare, as the people. And you have, in China at present, 200 million domestic migrant workers who have no adequate social security and social protection because they're not in their province of origin, and they don't have the, what's it called, hoku or something like that, which is the Chinese propiska. So not being where you should be, and who says where you should be, is one of the big issues. I'll remember this thing about Shakespeare's troupe being itinerary.
Yes, yeah. They're good. There's good documentary evidence about these practices, because the Reed Project in Toronto, the Records of Early English Drama, has court records of, the company went into Norwich, and the mayor of Norwich said, "You can't perform here," and they said, "Well, we have a letter from the Earl of Pembroke," and he said, "I don't care what the Earl of Pembroke. It's on the other side of the country." And there was a court prosecution. So there are lots of examples of that. It makes me think again about one of your other questions, which is, why is there this interest in the alien other in the theater? But Shakespeare becomes an alien by moving from Stratford-upon-Avon to London, and then he renews that experience as he travels into the provinces. And then they do travel, I don't know if Shakespeare went with them, but the players do travel to France and as far as as Poland on the continent.
Wow.
Yeah,
Didn't know that.
that's right. So they are itinerant artists.
Mhm.
They do create a home base, and it begins to be more profitable. But they do travel. They travel often if there's play in the city. They'll get out of town.
No, but they also, I mean, it's also a permanent test between the universality of humanity, humanness, and the claim of sovereignty that the law wants to have established, that the powerful want to implement.
Yeah.
That hasn't stopped. I mean, our governments are constantly saying that they're going to seal the border, which is a fantasy.
But literature is not. I mean, the only thing I would say is that literature is not always on the side of the angels, because it's often its representations of the alien other are not empathetic, are not fully humanizing. But I'd say it's on the side of the angels because it is itself migrant. It's always on. It is, generally true about literature is that it's always on the move.
Yeah.
Temporarily as well as geographically.
And it challenges those who want to immobilize
Yes.
status, time, money, power structures, etc.
Yeah, that's it.
It challenges that. And I think mobility is
Sure.
something which is under-theorized, probably, certainly in law.
Mm-hmm.
That would be interesting too.
Yeah, that's right.
There are many strands that we want to weave together. We don't know yet how this is going to happen.
That's a perfect condition to be in.
Yes.
That's exactly where you want to be.
Exactly. So, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Paul.
Entirely my pleasure.
This was great.
Thank you for this.
This was
Really
a
glad we got to do this.
lovely. The video will be on the website.